Welcome to the channel. The movie we're looking at today, Infinity Pool, is written and directed by
Brandon Cronenberg, aka David Cronenberg Jr.
It's his third film. His first was Antiviral back in 2012, which was unique, but it didn't do all that well. But young Brandon was only 32 at the time, so we give him a pass on that movie because we're not savages here. Not today, anyway. His second movie, despite being divisive because of its over-the-top stylized premise, earned him some very positive critical acclaim. It's called Possessor. It came out in 2020, and when you compare it to Antiviral, you really get the impression Brandon spent the entire 8 years between the two movies honing his skills, because I want to say it was great, but I can't yet, and I will explain why later. Infinity Pool's divisive like Possessor was, and you could argue it's for the same reasons. It's a lofty concept, and for some viewers it'll go beyond provocative in its visceral perversions. Aren't I talking all fancy? Look, Mom, I sound like Roger Ebert. You know what I meant. Rest in peace, Roger Ebert. But there's something here that's really bugging me, and I suppose that's the point of today's video. Like I said, I'm a fan of his second movie, Possessor, but I haven't reviewed it yet because I wanted to wait and see how his third movie turned out. Why? Because no matter how hard I try to separate Brandon from his living legend of a father, David Cronenberg, I can't. It feels like he's trying to be him, and he's not doing the best job at it. Allow me to elaborate really quickly. As a young, enthusiastic film fanatic on the rough streets of Toronto, I grew up in a perfectly lovely home. Toronto's streets are as smooth as butter, and I have no idea why I said that. I cut my baby movie teeth on powerhouse films like Shivers and Rabid and The Brood and Scanners and Videodrome and The Dead Zone and The Fly and Naked Lunch. Sorry folks, moviegasm. And now that I've seen Infinity Pool, even though young Brandon is completely rejecting the totally natural comparisons being drawn between him and his father's work, I can't shake the feeling he's just rehashing his dad's themes without any of the actual substance. Let me take you through the plot, and I will break down exactly what I'm talking about as we go along. And the usual reminder, full spoilers ahead. The movie opens with novelist James Foster, played by Alexander Skarsgård, and his wife Em, played by Cleopatra Coleman. They've just arrived at a resort while there's a local festival underway. Apparently, James hasn't written a novel in a really long time, and it's implied he's been living off his wife's family's money, and that creates tension between them right off the bat. And that tension gets cranked up a notch or two when Mia Goth's Gabby comes along and introduces herself as a fan of James' only novel. They all get together that night for dinner, and that leads to them heading for a trip to the beach the next day together, which happens all the time when you meet cool strangers on vacation. But earlier in the story, we're told tourists aren't allowed to leave the resort, so it's obvious something's gonna go wrong. When they get to the beach, it's littered with burnt out cars and broken down vehicles, and that's young Brandon letting us know something bad's gonna happen again. Sometimes filmmakers will foreshadow trouble in a subtle and ominous way. Other times, they'll just blatantly show you a close-up shot of a dead animal in the opening act. And when James goes behind a tree to relieve himself, Gabby shows up and grabs him from behind for a bit of "How's your father?" And I'll leave it up to you to decide if this is the bad thing young Brandon foreshadowed or not. I judge movies on this channel, not lifestyle choices. Cronenberg Sr., that is, David Cronenberg, is known for fearlessly tackling taboo subjects, and a lot of his movies have sexual stuff in them. A fantastic example is 1996's Crash. In that movie, the characters are drawn to the fetishized sexual allure of car crashes. On the surface, you can think, what the fuck? But if you go below the surface, which is what decent movies are meant to challenge you to do, Cronenberg's exploration of this idea causes us in the audience to think about the uncomfortable imagery and contemplate the complicated nature of human sexuality. I am starting to sound like a movie critic. Of course, with Crash, it's exaggerated greatly for effect, but that's how films work. Infinity Pool features some full frontal nudity, and there's a drug-fueled orgy, and in the scene I just described, young Brandon shows James Pearl Jam hitting the rocks on the beach. No matter how many times I've dragged these seedy images through my mind, I can't connect them to anything substantial. Beyond the obvious, wow, Mia Goth's shape has changed considerably since X, very deep. The day eventually dies off, and during the drunken drive back to the resort, James accidentally runs over a local farmer, killing him instantly. Gabby insists they don't contact the police because honesty won't get them anywhere with a corrupt local police force. The next morning, the police lift James from his hotel room and drag him into the police station and force him into a pair of flannel pajamas. And they tell him the dead man's son is entitled to kill him to restore his family's honor as per local law. So, in true Cronenberg fashion, David or Brandon, I'm not sure which at this point, James has the option of cloning himself for a substantial fee and having his duplicate killed in his place. And as James has married into money, he pays them, and the couple watches on as a duplicate stabbed to death. Another of Cronenberg Sr.'s defining characteristics is his exploration of body horror. His movies often feature transformations of the human mind and body, and he also blurs the lines between organic and mechanical. His best example of this, in my humble opinion, is The Fly. I did a fairly in-depth review of it where I discuss all of its various allegories and metaphors, but in a nutshell, he uses Seth Brundle's transformation from a man to a fly to examine the ideas of unchecked ambition and loss of identity and human mortality and love. What it's really worth when times actually get tough. And by the end of his movies, you're thinking about these things whether you want to or not. Now, Infinity Pool's body horror is as on the nose as it can get, given the characters are literally watching their own bodies getting repeatedly stabbed to death. And while I do see where he's going with it, with the obvious moral implication of crime without consequences, it doesn't inspire me to think about anything beyond that. Wouldn't it be cool if you could do stuff and not get in trouble? James books in for another week, at his wife's expense, of course, and ends up in a group with Gabby and a handful of other Western tourists who come back every year to get convicted of crimes intentionally. And they invite James to join them in their heinous criminal activities. And again, as this is a Cronenberg movie, you can see where I'm going with this, right? They take drugs and break and enter and abuse resort staff and exact revenge on the police who sentenced them in the first place. And there's murders and drug-filled orgies, and it's all shot competently, and even if I can't find anything meaningful behind the bright lights and pretty colors, it is lovely on the eyes. And one night after James believes he's established himself as a regular member of the gang in good standing, he learns the ground he's standing on is not the rock he thought it to be when they pull a fast one on him. And while he's beating a man he believes to be the chief of police, he learns it's actually another clone of himself. And for whatever reason, this realization sends him running for his passport. But the rest of the gang yanks him from his bus at gunpoint. And then, in a scene that grates on you like steel wool across your eardrums,
"Give us the coward, James! Faster!"
Mia Goth's Gabby tells him the group's just been messing with him for their own amusement and she's never even read his book. So he takes off butthurt into the wilderness and Gabby catches him in the thigh with a bullet as he's running. He finds his way to a farm where he collapses and he's taken inside to recuperate. As soon as he's better, Gabby and the gang show up and force him to kill another clone of himself introduced as a dog in order to supposedly complete his transformation. And he refuses, but when the clone attacks him, he fights back and ends up beating him to death. And after killing himself, Gabby breastfeeds him. Obviously, this is a rebirth metaphor. And seeing as James just literally murdered himself seconds ago in service of the exact same metaphor, I have to assume young Brandon threw in this additional imagery in case we weren't smart enough to pick up on it, or to be controversial. Either one of which his father would never have done. The next day is a typical final day of the holidays with everyone returning to their respective lives and wishing each other well at the airport. But James stays behind even though it's monsoon season and the resort's closing down, implying he's either changed too much to go back to his normal life, or the real James was killed and this is one of his heartless clones. Which one do I think it is? I don't really care. Cronenberg Sr.'s movies possess a psychological depth that go beyond the surface-level shock value of his visuals. His movies have a distinct, intentional tone that's usually unsettling and captivating. He gets inside his characters' minds and explores their fears and desires. And he challenges you to think about how you feel about the same things, meaning his films provoke thought. He's thought-provoking. His voice is strong throughout his movies. He's clear about what he's saying. And if it takes you and I a few views to clue into all of it, that's because his themes are complex and the questions he poses aren't easily answered. All of these individual elements combined consistently throughout his career make his movies instantly recognizable as his own. But on the other hand, I first watched Infinity Pool when it came out in March 2023, and I watched it twice again in preparation for this review. And if I had to describe it in 3 words, beautiful, grotesque, meaningless. And if it's made me think anything after 3 full viewings, it would be that it feels like a photocopy of his dad's work and not a high quality one. And now I'm worried the Possessor might have been a fluke, which means I'm going to have to watch it again and give it my undivided attention, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, unless of course it leads me to realize it was actually shit. Thanks for letting me ramble a bit on this one. Feel free to tell me where you agree or disagree down in the comments. I would appreciate that. And until next time, folks.
It's me, Johnny, from that thing you just watched. If you enjoyed it, go down there and smash me in the face to subscribe. And if you want to watch another thing, there's one right there. Do it!